T. Anselm and William Rufus. When a man has played a great part in his generation, and in the course of years the cause or quarrel in which he was engaged becomes obsolete and is forgotten, his name often survives and is handed on with a certain vague reverence. People know not why, volitat per ora virum, but the sound is lifeless and unmeaning. He has become a sort of shadowy EWWX of, without substance or distinguishable feature. The name of St. Anselm is thus preserved among us. When it is mentioned, we recognize it as one which is not quite new to us. But who he was when he lived, what he did, whether he was Archbishop of Canterbury or Constantinople, are questions about which a great proportion of readers would feel no shame in confessing ignorance. Yet St. Anselm was a great man. He was looked upon as the man of his time in the Western Church. He was one who in his day fought most nobly the good fight, and drew to himself the hearts of Christendom. Among all who have sat on the throne of Canterbury, none used to be looked upon as greater or more deserving of lasting remembrance in the English Church. But it was his fortune to be called to defend the cause of religion by deed and suffering against the pride and licentiousness of the feudal system, and to be one of the foremost in the contest. And this, which so endeared him to Englishmen of the 12th and 13th centuries, has made Englishmen of the 18th and 19th forget him. The cause to which he devoted himself so earnestly has ceased to be looked upon as the religious or the popular one. Where it does not call forth feelings of bitter hostility, it is regarded with suspicion or indifference. Partly from ignorance, partly from inveterate prejudice, we cannot get ourselves to look upon the great struggles between the Church and the Crown in the 11th and 12th centuries as other than political. From our childhood, we have been used to consider the efforts of the reforming party among the clergy as little short of rebellion, as mere ambitious and hypocritical aggressions on the state for the lowest and most selfish ends. We have connected with their cause disloyalty, superstition, lust of gain, narrowness of mind, and a hateful union of abject servility and domineering tyranny. Those dark times of priestcraft when popes and monks bearded the king and conspired to keep mankind in slavery both of body and soul. Such is our idea of the days of St. Anselm. At the best, the policy of the Church is regarded as mistaken, as an interference with matters beyond her sphere, savoring of worldliness and want of faith. But that the party of Gregory VII and St. Anselm was the religious one, that they were contending for objects not of this world, that they were the champions of truth and holiness, the reformers of their day, that they were on the right side, the side which good men now would have taken in those circumstances, and that the kings and nobles were in the wrong, were cruel and dangerous aggressors. This, we think, many of us find hard to believe, many more even to fancy. The notion is too much for their imagination. They can no more master it than they can conceive the French Revolution to have been right. This state of feeling has come about naturally, as many other things good and evil have come about in our generation, as most of us have ceased to believe in ghost stories, or suspect old women of witchcraft, or value a priest's blessing. This is not the place to discuss its deep and manifold causes, for we are writing not of the 19th century but of the 11th, of Anselm and his cause not of English national character. But we are anxious that this cause should be judged fairly, and there are one or two sources of prejudice against it which, while they are manifestly fatal to all true and high views of history, are also so very common and powerful that we cannot refrain from spending a few words on them before proceeding to the main subject of our review. 1. One of these sources of prejudice is the irreligious character of our popular historical traditions and of the literature which embodies and perpetuates them. Men go by tradition is most things, and in none more than in history, and the feelings and even the judgments with which it has prepossessed us often last long after opinion has ceased to support them. We have been brought up in familiar acquaintance with a history which may well have taken a strong hold on our imagination. But in that magnificent line of traditions, the Gesta Regum Anglorum, a series which for interest and sustained grandeur has no parallel but in the history of Rome, In the imposing picture presented by the unfolding and progress of the fortunes of the state and realm of England, we may look in vain for anything of higher stature or diviner mold than what belongs to this world. Our historians speak as they might of a great heathen empire, as if the most august and awful object in history, the Christian Church, deeply involved too as its fortunes have been with those of our own country, had no existence or were but a mere title or abstraction. The theory on which they write recognizes not religion as a standard or motive of public action. It is one which looks not beyond things temporal for greatness or reality, which holds no power entitled to exercise a direct and visible control on society, but that of the Crown or the Constitution. A theory on which the claim of the Church to speak and be listened to in the councils of kings, and to thwart, if need be, the policy of nations, is a simple absurdity. It is not too much to say that there is less in the popular history of the Christian kingdom of England which implies the reality of religion, less acknowledgement of the laws and agents of a divine government, partly concealed and partly manifested, to which the temporal rulers of the world are even here amenable, than in the legends or even the political history of Greece and Rome. Nor is there much to wonder at in this, considering that our great authorities on the subject of European history have been such as Hume and Robertson. Christians and churchmen have consented to receive as oracles the dicta of the unbeliever and the cold-hearted literature on the duties and objects of man and society, and to listen with obsequious patience while they superciliously gave judgment on the temper and relations of the Church and the conduct of her prelates. Their influence, no doubt, is somewhat shaken, yet their view and coloring of things still remain among us as the acknowledged and received one. Their tone of tranquil and deliberate contempt, scarcely disturbed even by bitterness, has become the keynote of the general feeling in England about churchmen and their cause. They have reconciled us to the belief that in the earlier times of modem history, those ages of reality, of young and exuberant life, there were nothing but hollow forms, sickening hypocrisies, uncouth and unmeaning technicalities, and taught us to measure purposes which stirred all Christendom as one man by the formulfy of an impertinent and shallow philosophy, the hopes of saints by the selfishness of fashionable society. It speaks ill for the character of any age when such writers could gain and keep the ascendant in history, ill for its genuineness of feeling, ill for its Christianity. The influence which Hume had on the public was given by the public, which had long been ready for him, and felt as he did. Indeed, between him and his predecessors in English history, there is not much to choose in their way of viewing ecclesiastical matters. He was an unbeliever, and they professed to be Christians. But there is in both the same ignorant contempt for what they call the Dark Ages, the same sneers at superstition, and priestcraft, the same invariable leaning to the worldly side, however undeniably bad its show and worthless its supporters, the same inability to conceive of any higher motives in the clergy than selfishness and ambition, the same insensibility to nobleness and height of character in them, however obvious. Nay, we may see the same spirit at work in deeper and more manly writers than the polite and ingenious of our Augustan age. Account for it as we may, ever since the Reformation, the feeling of our most Catholic writers, whenever they are led across the great contests of our early history, is for the most part on the side of the king and the state against the Church. The world has brought them to believe that in these struggles it was always the injured, if not the oppressed party, and an unequal match for the craft of its antagonist. It has insulted religion and blackened the memory of its defenders, and then called upon Christians to admire and honor its policy. And Christians have been weak and faithless enough to allow themselves for its sake to be estranged from their fathers and fellow champions in the faith, and have even rivaled it in its bitterness against them. Nowhere does this low morality and dislike of the Church appear more offensively and more mischievous-ly than in those books from which we first learn history, and which may be taken as fair exponents of popular notions upon the subject. The household traditions of England are now to be found, not in ballads and chronicles, but in the assemblage of unpretending little volumes, which we see advertised in the school catalogues of Messrs. Whitaker and Simpkin and Marshall, and some of which are to be met with in most nurseries and juvenile libraries in the United Kingdom. We have all of us been once familiar with them, a series of small books, none of them aspiring beyond 12 MO, and bound in a sort of official livery, blue, red, and green, or brown sheep with blue edges, prim and starched little skeleton compilations, the very essence of propriety and dryness, carefully starving as far as they can all appetite for the grand or poetical or romantic, and with all the decided conciseness, infallibility, and philosophical absence of feeling of a statistical report or treatise on political economy. These manuals of the Textus Receptus of English history give a view of their subject more remarkable for its uniformity than its consistency. For though they all fix on the same great men, the same good and bad kings, the same patriots and traitors, they are not nice as to principles. Loyalty and disloyalty, republicanism and high monarchical views are each, in their turn, grounds both of praise and censure. Just as Locke and Venerable Bede, Milton and Hooker, King Alfred and William III find themselves in company in a temple of British worthies. But with all their anomalies, these books follow one rule at least steadily and intelligently. They invariably take part with the political power, whatever it be, against the Church. In the contest between the ecclesiastical and civil powers, at whatever period, we are taught when children to take it for granted that all right and wisdom lay with the latter, to look upon all leading churchmen with aversion, and to doubt systematically in them alone purity of motive or reasonableness of purpose. Sympathy and admiration are claimed for political greatness or successful soldiership. For Christian faith and magnanimity and self-devotion, it is well if there is not a sneer. And these bad prejudices, which we thus drink in almost with our mother's milk, color our view, even in spite of ourselves, of the ecclesiastical questions of past history. 2. And our indifference or aversion to the cause of the Church in the Middle Ages is fostered by the strangely unreal notions which are afloat on the subject of ecclesiastical history, notions which have arisen not merely from an inability to alter our focus of vision in order to contemplate what is both very distant and set to a different scale of greatness from our own, but from a most baseless and fantastic idea of what was to be looked for beforehand in church history. Merry persons seem to think that they had a right to find it all along a fair and calm picture of holiness and purity. There should be no disturbances, no troubles, no quarrels about lands and rights. Nothing but meekness and peace, at least within. Not, of course, that there should be no suffering or difficulties, but they ought to be of the clearly heroic kind. Martyrdom and confession plainly add to the interest of any history. Martyrs and confessors, of course, there ought to be, but then they ought to be abstract ones without anything of commonplace real human nature about them, and the rest of the history ought to be made up solely fervent piety and unwearied zeal of the flock at large. Such, to judge from the way in which we often hear church history spoken of as it has been, would seem to be the common notion of what it ought to have been in order to be worth anything for a Christian of our day to study heartily and with interest. Now it is a light thing to assure such theorists that in the most despised periods of ecclesiastical history they will find abundance, if they will take the trouble to search for it, to satisfy their demands for religion, all but disengaged from the world. But they must not lay it down as a canon that nothing can be religious, except what is, as it were, disembodied and exhibited apart from the realities of life as we see it, that the highest principles and most saintly feelings cannot be at work in the business of the court or the marketplace. For it is not, for the most part, according to the existing order of things to find qualities or elements in an unmixed state. If we want them in a simple form, we must disengage them by thought and be kill for ourselves, or, it may be, they are not to be disengaged at all. If we seek for electricity, for galvanic or magnetic power, we must be content to possess their subtle virtues in Leyden jars, muscles of dead frogs, and bars of iron. When the church was founded, there was no new world created as a stage for Christians to act upon. They were still to be men, each with a different face and figure and character, living a certain number of years, every year made up of a certain number of days and seconds, of which each was to have its own object, feeling, and thought, a countless number, and of an infinite variety, to tempt, or soothe, or guide, or harass. Life was with them to be no poetical dream, but in its main circumstances and conditions exactly as commonplace, as real, as long as each of us finds it. Their Christian principles were not to be like propositions of Euclid or legal formulae, things to be thought of by themselves and paraded on certain occasions, but they were to work in and under the everyday realities of life, high and low, to hide themselves in all feelings and actions, to possess and inform character, to leaven insensibly whatever stirs and warms men's hearts. They were not meant for a gala robe, but for a working-day dress, and that for no fancy labor, but for the rough and dusty encounters of this, outwardly, very matter-of-fact and unromantic world. Yet people seem to forget these truisms when they come to study church history. They forget also that the Bible history itself had its outside face, not very different in appearance from what they object to in ecclesiastical history. Only in one we are brought within the veil of providence and are excluded for the most part in the other. It is therefore really no great wonder that from first to last, church history, like all other history of man, presents a series of conflicts between real men, carried on as contests are carried on now, with much in them that is bad, much that is ambiguous and difficult to disentangle and explain, much that is merely practical and very unpoetical, and what some call very unspiritual. That is to say, men were in earnest, they did not play at controversy, they carried on no paper war with imaginary and harmless antagonists, but a keen struggle with living opponents who felt as strong an interest in the events as themselves, and the strife was accompanied, as all real strifes are, with excitement and pain, with trouble, risk, and anxious uncertainty. Yet the very reality and earnestness of these controversies seem in our eyes a sufficient reason for not considering them of importance or interest, and this is especially the case with respect to the history of the Church of the Middle Ages, which we in England seem scarcely to consider religious history at all. Even the theological student neglects it. In his course of church history, he reads down to the end of the 4th or 5th century, and then with a huge bound passes over 10 centuries and begins again with the 16th. And the implied reason of this remarkable proceeding is that in those days of wonderful religious energy, when every question was a religious one, the history of the church was but external and secular. For the controversies of the 3rd and 4th centuries, the said student can see reason. For those of the 11th and 12th, none. The great controversies of the early church and those of the Middle Ages differed in 2 points. Those of the first 5 centuries were for the most part carried on with persons out of the pale of the church and on points of faith and doctrine. Those of the Middle Ages were mainly connected with life and morals, and were with men who knew no spiritual authority but hers. Her first opponents, quarreling with her as a teacher of religion, broke off from her, and set up parallel and antagonistic systems of their own. They were heretics and schismatics, self-condemned, and clearly marked out as such by their own formal and deliberate acts. There was no mistaking the grounds or the importance of the dispute. But in the 11th century, these heresies were things of a past age in the West, lifeless and inoperative carcasses of old enemies from whom the Church had little, comparatively, to fear for the present. She had living antagonists to cope with, but they were of a different sort. They were no longer the sophist and declaimer of the schools, but mail-clad barons. Just as she had subdued the intelligence and refinement of the old Roman Empire, it was swept away, and she was left alone with its wild destroyers. Her commission was changed. She had now to tame and rule the barbarians. But upon them the voice which had rebuked the heretic fell powerless. While they pressed into her fold, they overwhelmed all her efforts to reclaim them, and filled her from east to west with violence and stunning disorder. When therefore she again roused herself to confront the world, her position and difficulties had shifted. Her enemy was no longer heresy, but vice, wickedness, which wrought with a high hand, foul and rampant like that of Sodom or the men before the flood. It was not the faith, but the first principles of duty, justice, mercy, and truth, which were directly endangered by the unbridled ambition and licentiousness of the feudal aristocracy who were then masters of Europe. And these proud and resolute men were no enemy out of doors. They were within her pale, professed allegiance to her and to be her protectors, claimed and exercised important rights in her government and internal arrangements, plausible in their origin, strengthened by prescription, daily placed further out of the reach of attack by ever-extending encroachments, and guarded with the jealousy of men who felt that the restraints of church discipline, if ever they closed round them, would be fetters of iron. And with this fierce nobility she had to fight the battle of the poor and weak, to settle the question whether Christian religion and the offices of the church were to be anything more than names and honors and endowments, trappings of chivalry and gentle blood, whether there were yet strength left upon earth to maintain and avenge the laws of God, whoever might break them. She had to stand between the oppressor and his prey, to compel respect for what is pure and sacred from the lawless and powerful. The various forms which this great struggle took touched as truly the reality and permanence of religion as any of the earlier controversies with heresy. But its nature made it at the time, and makes it still, a difficult one. For a great practical controversy like the present, whether the feudal or the ecclesiastical, the military or the religious, principle should have its rightful predominance in European society, though as real in its grounds as that former contest which the Church waged against worldliness in the form of heresy, is less capable of being presented in a definite and clearly limited form, with all its due oppositions and distinctions, its complete detail of feature and circumstance, than a dogmatic controversy. Such a scene of conflict must, from the number of extraneous elements mixed up in it, present an appearance of vagueness or at least confusion. It must have many sides, and so be difficult to take in at once. It must be full of occasions for mistake and error, both for actors and spectators. For in such a case, the great principles in debate are scarcely ever presented in a pure and unembarrassed form. The contest is carried on not by opposing statements and arguments, but, so to speak, by moves, the meaning and effect of which are not always obvious even to him who makes them, which harmonize with and involve principles, but which do not necessarily disclose them. It is put upon issues and battled upon points which are often of disproportionately small importance to the real question which is felt to turn on them. The great interests at stake appear but accidentally on the face of the dispute, and we wonder at the eagerness and zeal which the ostensible objects of the contest call forth, till we come to see, as the combatants saw, that, trifling as they may be, they are from the force of circumstances the key of a whole position. Such a contest, moreover, must appear personal, for the real causes of dispute lying out of sight and being represented not so much by words as by the character and deeds of men, and further the different sides not being marked off by plain and broad lines and the combatants being intermixed, we are tempted to see nothing but individual interests and aims in cases where in reality a great cause has been fought for and lost or won. We contemplate only Henry and Gregory, their policy, their errors, and their success as men, and put out of sight the worldly or spiritual power which stood or fell with them. And further, where all parties have or claim specific rights in a common society, with some legitimate, some prescriptive or held by sufferance, some in abeyance, rights between Christian and Christian, clerk and layman, bishop and lord, rights possibly ill-defined and ill-adjusted, the conflict could be carried on for a long time without apparently touching those deeper and more real grounds of opposition which lay beneath. And, instead of a controversy about the most active principles and most vital interests of society, it would present outwardly the appearance of a series of technical and legal questions. Our remarks scarcely need illustration, but we are tempted to refer by way of instance to the struggle now going on in Lower Canada between the English and French population. Free as the Times, Fernoctin in 1842, the English are pouring in upon. We shall now proceed with our main subject, and endeavor to give in some detail one of the scenes in this contest as it was viewed from the side of the Church, and by persons who had it before their eyes and were engaged in it, taking from their own mouths what they believed and meant, what were their objects, how they felt, and what they hoped for. It is obviously as vain to expect to gain in any other way a real view of their position as it would be to look for a fair account of the stand lately made in defense of church property from a liberal who hates everything ecclesiastical. Our position towards those times ought not to be an external one. We ought to look at them neither as advocates nor as mere critics, but as churchmen. And indeed it is high time to do so if we wish posterity to do justice to our own motives in resisting church spoliation. We too are embarked in the same cause, and we certainly have not more to show than they had, to prove our disinterestedness. Anselm's time was an era in the history of the English Church, and the transactions in which he was engaged are rendered yet more interesting by his personal character. For we must not forget that the great champion of ecclesiastical liberty was also the profoundest and most original writer that had appeared in the Latin Church since St. Augustine, or that he was the great model in his The French Holders of the Soil, endeavoring to establish themselves and to get the land into their own hands. The French feel that their religion, their language, their habits and ways of life, all that is dear to them, and has hitherto made them happy, must be swept away if their rough and enterprising neighbors, who have but small sympathy with them, should by dint of greater capital gain their footing. With the French, the effort to keep the English out is a struggle for existence. Cumbrous and intricate system of French law to which property in Lower Canada is subject, and it is on the minutiae and technicalities of this law that the battle is fought between the two races. Time of high Christian character, in its most winning and graceful, as well as in its severest aspect. Yet his history has never been treated, at least in England, with the special attention it deserves. Except in the heavy pages of Collier, we know not where the English reader would find a full account of him. The work which originally suggested these remarks was the first attempt to supply the Defici Ensi, a translation of a posthumous essay of Dr. Moeller by Mr. Reimer. Dr. Moeller's object was to draw attention to what really was the state of religion and thought in the times of the great struggle between the Church and the Empire, and to exhibit the moral, ecclesiastical, and literary life of the period in the history of its greatest and most complete representative. It was the work of one who thoroughly appreciated Anselm and his times. But it is much to be regretted that coming from a man who viewed his subjects so thoughtfully and with so clear and steady an eye, it should have appeared in so very unattractive a form. It could scarcely have been intended for publication as it stands. As a composition, it is loose and rambling, too discursive for a history, and without arrangement enough for a dissertation. Important views suggested by the course of the story are continually breaking its thread by the length to which they are pursued. Yet they are never distinctly worked out. The narrative is spiritless and flat in a history which has interest enough for a romance, and there is throughout a carelessness in statements of fact which is unaccountable in one who evidently had his authorities before him. Nor were the defects of the original supplied in the translation. The most careful part of the work is the essay at the end on the scholastic philosophy of St. Anselm. The contemporary materials for a life of Anselm are unusually full and interesting. He held correspondence with persons in every part of Europe and even in Asia and in every vocation and grade of society. And of this correspondence, which brings out in a most striking manner his character and objects, a large portion is preserved, extending over part of his private and almost the whole of his public life. Further, we have two singularly interesting and graphic accounts of his public and private life by an eyewitness, Eadmer, an English monk of Canterbury, who was his companion and most intimate friend all through his troubles and exile, and was afterwards Archbishop of St. Andrews, a man of sense and great observation, somewhat disposed to gossip, but remarkably simple and natural in his accounts, and apparently quite entitled to the deference which has always been paid to his authority. 2. By his contemporaries, Ordericus Vitalis, who wrote in Normandy, and William of Malmesbury, whose work was dedicated to a son of Henry I, one of Anselm's opponents. Such are our main sources of information. The two contests in which Anselm was successively engaged with William Rufus and Henry I are sufficiently distinct to be considered separately. His antagonist in the first was the lawless violence of feudalism. In the second, its craft and unscrupulous intrigue. The grounds, too, of the dispute, which in the first appear in a vague and general form, were brought to a distinct question in the second. These two contests will form the subjects, respectively, of the present and the following essay. To understand what these struggles really meant and involved, we must keep before our eyes throughout that idea of the Church, of its nature and position in the world, which men in those days had received from their fathers and took for granted, supposing that they saw it in every line of Scripture. The Church as set up by the Apostles was an organized society destined to pursue in the world Wharton, Anglia Sacra, E. 182, 183.1. Objects beyond the world, with laws and a polity not of man's ordering, governed by powers delegated indeed to men, but not from men. It was a real and visible kingdom, distinct from the kingdoms of this world and independent of them, as well when embracing as when confronting them, with objects and ends, over all earthly ones, paramount. With these unearthly ends, or with the powers granted to the Church to carry them out, by her invisible yet ever-present King, the powers of this world can never innocently interfere. However the Church's essential nature may be obscured by the sin of her members, yet while she exists, her rights and claims must be indefeasible, for they are truly His, to whom the heathen have been given for His inheritance. Princes of the earth, whatever may have been yielded to them for honor's sake or convenience, may have been usurped by wrong, inherited or acquired by usage, betrayed by cowardice, or sold by worldliness, can never gain rights over the Church in her own province, rights to set aside her laws, to wield her powers, or alter her objects. For these laws, powers, and objects are beyond the sphere to which earthly power can as such extend. Many things, policy, compacts, justice, may prevent the Church at any particular moment from reclaiming what is her own, but forfeit it finally to the state she cannot. The convenience of time may not set itself in competition with the claims of what is eternal. Further, this Church, as it was not of the earth, knew no distinctions, no essential ones at least, of rank or country. Giving honor where honor was due, it did so only in subordination to its own fundamental laws. Two of those laws were unity and purity. Be men what they might, they were to be made one in the Church, and in her to remain one. Be they what they might, if they openly and deliberately committed sin, they were without respect of persons to be punished by her. To the apostles had power been given by our Lord to punish and pardon, to engraft and cut us. By them had this power been passed on to others, who transmitted it in their turn. And besides these, other rightful judges and rulers in the kingdom of God and its concerns there were none. Everyone knows how the kingdom of God continued separate in its outward position till the kingdoms of the world broke before it, and it stood in the midst of the wreck of the Roman Empire, the one great object of deep interest and awe to all men, conquerors and conquered, Greek and Latin, German and Lombard, Frank and Goth. The princes of the nations and their multitudes were forced to bow before its majesty and become its subjects. But then came trouble. They would be in it what they were in their own earthly kingdoms. Honored in its pale as kings, they found it hard to be in any sense subjects. Those times, which it is the fashion to represent as the era of ecclesiastical usurpation, will, as we have already said, be found to have been periods of systematic and unceasing encroachment on the rights of the church by the lay powers. The gospel law had come to be acknowledged as the one ruling principle in Europe, and therefore, of course, the church had power and that which comes with power. Her princes sat in high places. She had her broad lands and her palaces, her honors and royalties. But she held all this in the face of a world which grudged the moment it had given. Oppression, fraud, or compromise were continually at work, abridging her apostolic rights and confounding them in order to weaken them with those of a merely temporal origin and reference, step by step effacing her independent and unearthly character and bidding fair to dispense altogether with her divinely imposed laws of unity and holiness. At length, the intolerable license which reigned through the church and the utter powerlessness of her rulers to check it, in the past to which things had come produced, as we know, the great reaction and reform of the 11th century, a reaction which, whatever means it may have used, or whatever other effects it may have produced, humanly speaking, saved Christianity itself in the West. Its leaders boldly reverted to the ancient truths of the Church's intrinsic independence and the divine origin and really unearthly nature of her powers, and keeping their eyes steadily on these, they risked a conflict with the armed might of Europe. Their cause rested on the following points. 1. That the Church is not only the appointed witness of the faith, but also the guardian of holiness and justice in the world, and is as much bound to act on the offensive and to make sacrifices in behalf of the latter as of the former. 2. That the rebuke of John the Baptist to Herod is a precedent for Christian bishops in dealing with the great of the earth, whose rank ought no more to exempt them than the lowest from the rebukes and punishments of the Church. 3. That the powers of the Church, as they were not of men, ought not to be holden of men, that her rebukes and punishments, as they are no part of earthly power, ought neither to be directed nor held back by that power, and that the only way of escaping this interference in any degree was by securing to the Church that independence which her Lord had left her. Hence it was that the questions of simony and lay investiture became so prominent. To restore strength and efficiency to the Church by establishing and applying these principles in their various details was the work to which the religious party of St. Anselm's day thought themselves called, and they set about it bravely and like men. The world has seldom seen such depth and unity of character. We may call it one-sided, but it was one-sidedness which pursued its noble and Christian enterprise with a steadiness of aim, with a breadth and grandeur of plan, with an inflexible earnestness, with a completeness of execution, in comparison of which our efforts to do good seem often but of mixed purpose and uncertain fulfillment. And of this great party in its various aspects, social, political, intellectual, and religious, the foremost and most perfect representative was Anselm. When the storms from without, we quote Dr. Moeller, had been laid, then commenced in the Church the happy struggle for regeneration. Anselm was one of the first who entered into this conflict with prudence and with firmness, and of few can it be said that they exercised so universal an influence. The great exertions of his age had only one internal profound motive. To this unity of object they must all be referred, else they would all and each be without a real signification. But when we have considered this one and true spring of action, we see that it divides itself into various manifestations, of which each called into life a particular power, a distinct talent of the human mind. It was only during the entire period that it was fully developed. The entire body of the contemporaries of Anselm displayed it in its whole, but he united in himself so many talents and powers that in every regard he represented the whole in which so many formed a part. This whole, divided into a multiplicity of manifestations, was the religious enthusiasm, the renewed yearning after divine and eternal things, which had been so long stifled in the miseries and melancholy woes of the times. The flame of religion struggled for freedom, and in the glow which it produced, the chains by which the human mind had been held captive melted away. Their contest with the civil powers was but one part of their vast and connected movement, but it was an integral part of it. For the real point at issue between the rulers of the Church and the feudal princes of Europe, at the period of which we are speaking, was whether the gospel law was in very deed to be considered the supreme law of the Church and of every member of it, or whether, on the other hand, Christians, when entrusted by God with the temporal government of their fellow Christians, acquired thereby a certain right of exemption from the obedience to the Christian law to which their brethren were bound, and a control over the powers and sanctions by which that obedience was to be enforced. The existence of such a law, binding on the whole body politic, for all were members of the one Catholic Church, and the abstract rights and powers of those persons in whom the administration of that law was vested, were not denied. But there was another law, of military obedience and service, which the new population of Europe had brought with them from their forests, and which was strongly and deeply fixed in their minds. And the question was whether this was not a check or even bar to the Church's law, whether the powers of the Christian dispensation, the reality of which no one then questioned, were not by this antagonist law to be controlled and fenced off, whether the obedience and fealty due to a feudal superior, ties which were certainly felt to be of a most stringent kind, were not to dispense or debar a clergyman from doing what otherwise would be his clear and undoubted duty, as standing in the place of the apostles, towards those who professed to be disciples of the apostles. This struggle did not begin in England till the time of Anselm. For though the church policy of William the Conqueror was in theory perhaps the most tyrannical of any in Europe, its evils were practically kept in check by the personal characters of the king and the Archbishop Lanfranc, men very similar in temper, severe, earnest, and practical, each the other's equal in resolution and ability, and who thoroughly understood and trusted one another. William seconded heartily Lanfranc's measures to restore discipline and learning in the English Church. He had political as well as other reasons for doing so, and Lanfranc, though in his reforms determined and unyielding even to the king, studiously kept aloof from the party and policy of Gregory VII. By a sort of tacit compromise, no point seems ever to have been raised between the two which might open the great questions at issue on the continent. In their day, these questions remained in abeyance. The Conqueror's church policy, which, as we have said, certainly had in part for its object to promote vigor, regularity, and strictness in the church, is marked by two main features. One is the disposition to give and guarantee to the church, within certain limits, a separate and independent jurisdiction. In the important council, or rather parliament, of Lillebonne, 1080, this was done for Normandy L. From the floating mass of precedents and customs, definite laws were extricated and fixed in writing. The province of the episcopal courts marked out with tolerable equity questions about traditionary rights between the feudal and ecclesiastical powers adjusted, and provision made for settling future claims. In the enactments at Lillebonne, all offenses against the Church and her ministers, all crimes of impurity and irreligion, and all offenses committed by persons in holy orders were reserved for the judgment of the bishop. In England, the same disposition to recognize and guard the jurisdiction of the Church appears in the separation of the bishop's court from the secular court of the hundred, and the distinct and clear admission of the independence of that law by which the bishop was to judge. The king's mandate, by virtue which this separation was to take place, expresses a strong desire for the restoration of church laws to their purity and force, and secures their exercise from the secular interference to which it had hitherto been subject. And the frequent councils held during William's reign prove that he meant what he said. But if William, for a feudal sovereign whose will was law, went out of his way to make the church more active and powerful than she had been, he did so under the full consciousness and with the distinct and jealous assertion of his absolute control over her at the moment. Few points of ecclesiastical supremacy were claimed by Henry VIII which were not also claimed and possessed, though it may be differently used, by Norman William. All matters in church and state, says Eadmer, waited on his beck. He had, in England at least, the absolute nomination of bishops and abbots, and though his appointments were in general good ones, at least in his later years, he never lost sight of his political interests, and had no scruple in making use of his power of election to keep in order a troublesome city or a refractory Anglo-Saxon monastery L. See his conversation with his chaplain Samson about the one bishopric of Le Mans, Ordericus Vitalis, Ifr 531. See also W. Malms, Vici S. Aidhelm, Wharton Vitru 39. Turold was first appointed abbot of Glastonbury. Idem Turoldus, dom tyrannidem in subjectos ageret, ad Bur, Peterborough, a rege translatus est, abbatium opulentum, sed quae tunc a latrunculis, duce quodam heravardo, infestaretur, quia inter paludis sita erat. Per splendorem Dei, inquit, quia magis se agit militem quam abetem, invenium e comparem, quia soltus ejus accipiat. Abbot Brand, Turold's Pri, Dese defuncto, Ernaldo Cenomanorum Episcopo, Guilelmus Rex Dixit, Samsoni Bagiocensi Capellano suo, Cenomanensis Episcopatus, sede suo viduata est antistite, in qua volente Deo tenunc volo subrogare, Cenomanis Acanina rabie dicta, urbs est antique, et plebs ejus finitimis est procax et sanguinotenta, dominisque suis semper contunax et rebellionis avida. Pontificales igitur habenas tibi tradere decerno, quema pueritia nutrivi et amavi sedulo, et nunc inter maximos regni inei proceres sublimare desidero. Samson respondit, Secundum apostolicum traditionem oportet episcopum irreprehensibilum esse. Ego altern in omni vita mea sum valde reprehensibilis, omnibusque mentis et corporis ante conspectum deitatis sum pollutes flagitius, nec tantum decus contingere possum, pro sceleribus meis miser et despica. Bilis. Rex dixit. Calidus es et perspicaciter vidis quad tu rite peseatorum te confiteri debes. Fixum tamen in de statui sententium, nec ati statutum convolam, quin episcopatum suspicias, aut alium, qui prota prasul fiat, porrigas. His auditus gevisus Samson eat. Dei nunc, domine mi rex, optime locentus es, et ad hoc agendum admini, conlante Deo me promptum invenies. Se in capella tua est quidam pauper clericus, sed nobilis et bene morigeratus. Huia processulatum regi autem percunctanti quis esset. Samson respondit, hoelus dicitur, et est genere brito, sed humilis est, et revera bdinus homo. Ser 11, Volunder 2, 248, ed le provost. practice of investiture, which had come down to him from his Saxon predecessors, assumed under him a new and much more definite meaning when it came to be interpreted by the principles of the feudal law. But the position in which he established himself towards the church is seen most clearly in three very important constitutions mentioned by Eadmer, no random acts of power, but parts of a systematic and well-understood policy. These innovations, as Eadmer calls them, were 1. That no one might recognize a pope in England till the king had ordered him to be acknowledged, or receive letters from him till they had been seen by the king. 2. That the English church and council assembled under the primate might pass no laws or canons, but such as were agreeable to his pleasure, and first ordained by him. 3. That no bishop might implead or punish any of the king's vassals, even for incest, adultery, or any other such great sin, except by the king's precept. J. These principles, of which we see the fruit in the following reign, struck at once at the independence and at the legislative and executive power of the Church, and implied her absolute subjection to the feudal law. She was absorbed and incorporated into the feudal system at a time when it was most important that she should stand clear of it, on ground of her own, in evident possession of authority underived from any child of man, protesting against and resisting the injustice and impurity of the world. In William's policy, the feudal sovereign was the source of ecclesiastical as of civil authority. As he had his feudatory barons, so he had his feudatory bishops, both invested with their office and dignity by him, both bound to him by the same oath of homage. This tie of feudal allegiance and fealty, then the strongest bond between man and man, had been thrown over the rulers of the church, not only as subjects and holders of land, but as bishops. And by virtue of it, the king claimed from them, as of right, feudal obedience, without reserve and without appeal, in the discharge of their office as bishops. They were the great church officers of the crown, appointed to govern the church for the king, and according to his wisdom and policy to make laws and to execute them, not by their own authority, but by his. The last appeal was not to the law of the gospel, but to the customs and precedents of feudalism. The powers of the church were surrendered against all but the weak and helpless, and a large body of her members, and those the most licentious and unruly, the mass of the soldiery of the kingdom, were avowedly withdrawn from that control and discipline which she was to exercise at her own discretion and peril, without respect of persons. Such was the condition in which the conqueror left the church to his successor. He had carried out his policy without meeting any opposition from the clergy. It is not difficult to understand their acquiescence in it, even on the part of such men as Lanfranc. For good certainly came of it, great and manifest good, in a most wild and lawless time. The strongest arm in England, the only power which could make itself felt in such a breakup of society, was on the whole on their side. Why should they, at such a distance from the scene of conflict between the Church and the Empire on the continent, and moreover so much perplexed by its events, with fierce and unscrupulous Norman soldiers to deal with on the one hand, and a jealous Anglo-Saxon population, of whose language they were ignorant on the other, why should they turn it against themselves? Certain it is that the only voice that was raised against William's policy towards the English church was Guitmund's, a Norman monk, whose name Anselm couples with Lanfranc's in point of reputation in his day. Guitmund refused preferment in England on the ground that William had no right to dispose of the English sees and abbeys against the wishes of the people. "Search the Scriptures," he said to William, "and see by what law it is allowed that a pastor elected by their enemies should be placed by force over the Lord's flock? An ecclesiastical election ought first to be honestly made by the faithful themselves who are to be governed, and then, if canonical, confirmed by the assent of fathers and friends, if otherwise, in all charity amended." But Guitmund's boldness met with no sympathy in England or Normandy. It was well, perhaps, that the struggle between the English church and feudalism did not fall on the days of a king who, by the force of circumstances, bore rule in her hour of greatest helplessness, and who, with all the foresight, political talent, and unscrupulousness of his successors, had an iron firmness of will which no opposition could have turned from its purpose. He was a very once stark man, says the Saxon Chronicle, savage, so that no man durst do anything against his will. He had earls in his bonds who had done against his will. Bishops he set off their bishoprics, abbots off their abbotries, and thanes in prison. And at last he did not spare his own brother Odo. Him he set in prison. But, as it was, the Church had time to recover during his reign from the weakness and want of tone which prevailed before the conquest, and from the frightful disorders and overthrow which attended it. She had found a protector and favorer in one who might have been her most terrible enemy. But on the 9th September 1087, the famous baron, who had wrought greater things and caused more misery than any of his fellows in Europe, was taken away from human affairs. He died almost alone. Those whose attendance he most desired, Lanfranc and Anselm, were kept from his deathbed by distance or sickness. When his corpse had been deserted by his children and servants and left without covering on the bare floor, he was indebted for his burial to an obscure country knight who Gorki Jontiki, for the love of God, brought his body to Cannes, and his grave in his own noble monastery of St. Stephen was at the moment of burial forbidden him by a boar from whom he had of old violently taken the ground on which it stood. His friend and coadjutor, the great archbishop, great not in having founded an empire but reformed a church, followed him shortly. He had seen but too certainly the troubles that were coming and left their full weight for his successor. That successor was Anselm. He was not a man fitted seemingly by nature and training for such a lot. Like Lanfranc, he was the son of an Italian noble. He was born at Aosta in Piedmont, where his parents lived in affluence. His mother was a woman of warm and quiet piety, and her lessons early exerted a strong influence on his mind. As a boy, he was full of the strange, simple faith of childhood. Brought up among the Alps, he used to fancy that heaven rested on the mountain tops, and sleeping or waking, his thoughts were ever running on what it held. He soon distinguished himself in the public schools and showed a strong disposition for the life of the cloister. But his wishes were checked by his father and gave way at last before his opening prospects of rank and wealth. As he grew up, his love of religion and even of literature was damped by the amusements and pursuits of his station. His mother died early in his youth, and then the ship of his heart, says his biographer, having lost its sole anchor, drifted Exoff almost entirely into the waves of the world. What seemed to await him was the life of coarse and uneasy riot, the authority, importance, and brawls of a village noble, ending, perhaps, in the death of a dog at the foot of the Alps. But providence, which had marked out for him so high a destiny, drove him from his home and country by the unappeasable harshness of his father. With one companion he crossed Mont Cenis, and after 3 years spent in Burgundy and France, came to Normandy. At the time of his arrival, all nations which spoke the Latin tongue, say the chronicles, were ringing I admire, with the fame of the Abbey of B in Normandy and its prior Lanfranc. 20 years before, a few cells of the homeliest kind were rising beside a mill in the wooded valley of the Rille, not far from Rouen. A rude old soldier named Herluin bad with some trouble obtained permission of his feudal lord to devote himself and his patrimony to religion, and had retired to this spot with his mother and a few companions, over whom he presided as superior. All day long he was employed in building. Most of the night he spent in learning to read and in getting the Psalter by heart. His mother baked for the monks, washed their clothes, and performed all the menial offices of the house. Herluin was with his own hands building the bakehouse of the monastery when a Lombard stranger applied for and received admission. This was Lanfranc. He was the son of a nobleman at Pavia, eminent there as a lawyer, then in exile, a traveling student, a disappointed teacher, At last, robbed of everything and left penniless by the roadside, he had inquired for the meanest monastic establishment in the neighborhood and had been directed to B. To raise money for his brethren, who could not even afford oil to burn in their church at night, the Lombard had reluctantly opened a school. He taught as none had taught in Normandy before. The few mean cells grew into a noble abbey, the great light of the West, the rival of Clugny in discipline, and its superior in learning. Lanfranc's school was filled with disciples of all nations, of high and low degree, laymen and clerics. Among his pupils were some of the most distinguished continental churchmen of the time: Pope Alexander II, Ivo of Chartres. Grit mainly trained in the cloisters of B. The task was shortly to be committed of remolding and revivifying in England the Church of St. Augustine. Thither among the throng of students came Anselm, another Lombard wanderer, traveling, according to the fashion of those days, to acquire knowledge. He soon far outstripped his fellow pupils, and his genius and untiring industry gained him the especial regard of Lanfranc, who employed him to teach under himself. Meanwhile, the wish of his boyhood revived for a religious life. But such a step was not to be taken hastily, and long and anxiously did he think about it, and about the best plan of such a life. Should he become a hermit, or live under rule and vow on his patrimony, dispensing it all for the benefit of the poor? Or enter a monastery? If he entered a monastery, B was the most natural place for him, but his unconscious ambition suggested, so he confessed afterwards, that at B he would be lost and be of no use while Lanfranc taught there. Clugny, again, was as strict as B, but discouraged learning. At last he put his case unreservedly into the hands of Lanfranc and the Archbishop of Rouen. Under their advice he resolved to devote himself to a monastic life, and at length assumed the habit at B. 3 years after his admission, the virtual government of the monastery passed into his hands, on his succeeding Lanfranc as prior, and 15 years later, on the death of Herluin, the simple-hearted and venerable founder, he was elected abbot LB, lost nothing under his rule of what it had gained under Lanfranc. Very different in character and cast of mind from his great predecessor, he worked in the same cause and with equal earnestness and success. His monastery still continued one of the chief centers of religious and intellectual activity to England, Normandy, and even France, awakening thought and restoring a practical and strict sense of Christian duty in their wild and unsettled population by its own example of holiness and by the numerous pupils which it was continually sending forth from its school. The pursuits to which Lanfranc had given the first impulse by his clear and eloquent lectures and his great erudition Anselm carried forward by his freshness and vigor of thought and his native genius for refined metaphysical speculation. He governed his monastery with skill, no such easy task in days when the abbot had to exercise more personal superintendence and more severity over grown men of all ages than the master of a large school would now venture upon towards his boys. Lanfranc was famous for his powers of government. Anselm, by his clear insight into character, his patience and firmness, and his winning affectionateness, had as much hold on his monks as Lanfranc had gained by his knowledge of the world and his forcible and commanding character. To those in health, says Edmer, Anselm was a father, to the sick a mother. He seemed to have found the sphere for which he was intended. In the quiet of his monastery, his subtle and active intellect could pursue without interruption that striking line of speculation, full of devotion, though so abstract and methodical, the love of which haunted him like a passion one, and which began a new era in Latin theology. He had pupils round him whose minds were kindling at his own, and friends to whom he could open his heart with the frankness and warmth which were such strong features of his character, features of which we see so much in his letters, and which would almost have seemed softness, except in one under such stern and strong self-discipline. And further, the presence and society of a large body of men, all of them more or less sincerely engaged in efforts after a religious life, dependent on his care and needing his succor and counsel, gave infinitely varied play to a character peculiarly delicate and skillful in its appreciation and treatment of others. He found also in his monastery what ensweared to and satisfied his deep feeling of devotion, in those services of unwearied praise and prayer, and those opportunities for self-recollection by which men were permitted in those days to realize in so vivid a manner the communion of saints and the presence of the invisible. His influence reached far beyond the walls of his cloister. His high and self-devoted religion and his name as a writer and teacher told even upon the world without, and to these he added popular qualities of a singularly engaging kind. His striking reality and simplicity of character, set off by a strong dash of humor, his good sense and considerateness, his graceful condescension to the weak and poor, his gentleness and evenness of temper, veiling such unquestionable seriousness of purpose and sternness towards himself, won upon all hearts, even that of the iron-minded conqueror. Ben John G. E. say, when he used to teach or give advice, says Admer, he was especially careful to be most plain-spoken, avoiding all pomp and generalities, and illustrating his meaning as best he could by any homely or familiar example. All men rejoice at his converse. He gained the love of young and old, of men and women, of rich and poor, and all were glad to minister to him. Of so frank and glad a spirit was he to all, and so readily did he enter into their ways, as far as he might without sin. He was the darling of France and Normandy, known and welcome also in England. After his first visit to England, there one was no earl or countess or great person there who did not think that they had missed favor in the sight of God, if they haply had not had an opportunity of rendering some service to Anselm, abbot of B. Such was the course to which Anselm seemed to be called, to the calm and meditative life of the cloister, where he might influence his generation by his example and writings and by the minds which he formed there, to be the counselor and doctor of his age, calling forth seriousness around him, to be the father of a great religious brotherhood, and, in the world, to be an example of primitive saintliness, carrying blessing and commanding veneration and love wherever he appeared. Anselm was 27 when he finally resolved to leave all, and entered for good on what seemed to be his work in life. He had done forever with the world, with its consolations and joys, as he thought, with its storms also. 33 years of peace were granted him, during which he served God and his brethren in gladness of heart, without thought or fear of change. But they were only to be a long respite. The last of them found him still at B, an old man, expecting to die there, but in reality with the great work and trial of his life not yet begun nor looked for. In the year 1092, William Rufus had been 4 years on the throne, and had let loose feudalism in all its lawlessness upon England. The hearty frankness, high spirit, and generosity of his youth had degenerated, especially since the death of Lanfranc, from whom he had received his education and knighthood, into a brutal passion for the wildest debauchery and a savage impatience of every kind of restraint. Not that even now he was without the remains of what might have been a fine character. Gleams of nobleness and generosity broke out at times in the midst of his boisterous orgies and his fiercest bursts of rage. In his rough and cruel merriment he did not want for humor, which seems even sometimes to have been a veil under which he expressed self-reproach. But he was frantic with, 1. His excessive power. The truth must be told is the reluctant avowal of William of Malmesbury, who can scarcely help making him a hero, and who would be inclined to think, geez, or if our Christianity allowed, the doctrine of metempsychosis, that the soul of Julius Caesar had reappeared in William. The truth must be told. He feared God very little, and men not at all. His government was a full-blown specimen of that worldly and cruel system which was in various ways endeavoring to undermine the power which Christianity still maintained over society. A government which, while it allowed any amount of wickedness and oppression among the powerful, the barons and their dependents, repressed with a strong hand and unsparing severity any breach of the Comte de King's peace, among the poor and weak. William, says Ordery Cusquet, a contemporary, took great delight in military distinctions and showed their possessors much favor for worldly pomp's sake. He took no care to defend the country people against the soldiers, and suffered their property to be laid waste with impunity by his retainers and armed followers. He was of a strong memory and ardent will, both to good and to evil. He was terrible in his vengeance against thieves and petty robbers, and with a high hand enforced unbroken peace throughout all his dominions. All the inhabitants of his realm he either won over by his bounty or kept down by his valor and terror, so that no one dared to mutter a word against him. Appeal to the church was vain. William, who openly and avowedly hated religion, trampled upon her and plundered her to support his profuse expenditure, which was on the same wild scale as everything else in his character. The higher clergy suffered and heard the groans of the poor and defenseless in silence. However some of the best of them may have been ashamed of their feebleness, they all feared to measure their strength with so rough an antagonist, and commit themselves to an untried and perilous struggle in which even the highest and most undaunted faith could scarcely hope to be allowed to witness its own victory. William therefore proceeded to treat church property and offices as his own. In his father's time, the revenues which accrued to a see or abbey during a vacancy were handed over in full to the next holder. The appointment to the offices, though almost always made by the crown, was yet looked on as a trust. But William Rufus asserted the king's full and exclusive right of property in every possession of the church, and he acted systematically on this claim. As soon as a church became vacant, a king's commissioner went down and took possession, and it was either disposed of to the highest bidder for the king's profit, or kept vacant altogether. The revenue going meanwhile to the exchequer won. Church benefices were treated as if they were simply royal domains, to be granted or withheld at the king's pleasure. It is not, however, to William alone that the credit of these proceedings is due. The man whose influence was supreme in England during most of his reign, and who was the contriver and agent of these and other financial measures of the same sort, was a low-born Norman ecclesiastic, named Ralph Pass Saflaberry, or, as he was surnamed, Flambard, the Firebrand, a personage whom his contemporaries seem to have looked at with a mixture of horror, indignation, and amusement. What Cleon was to the Athenian democracy, Ralph Flambard was to the feudal king. By his talent for coarse and boisterous jokes and his noisy and unfailing merriment, he had become William's chief boon companion. But the king soon found in him a servant as fierce-tempered, unscrupulous, and fearless as himself, and possessed of far superior talents for intrigue and legal chicane. Impudent, cunning, and ready, with a tongue which nothing could silence, and activity and resolution which set at naught all opposition, he simply laid himself out to enrich his master. He was placed at the head of the exchequer and rose to be justiciary of England and Bishop of Durham. In those high offices no class was secure from him, and he cared as little for the hatred of the court as he did for the curses of the poor. Among William's proud barons, the upstart cleric was prouder and more overbearing than they, and his address, boldness, and good fortune carried him safe through their plots against him. Even after William's warm death, in spite of the universal detestation in which he was held, in spite of Henry's personal hatred of him and the part he had taken against Henry, in spite of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Pope, he contrived to retain his bishopric till his death. And, when confined to it, his restlessness and uncontrollable energy found a vent in great works for the defense of his principality and the adornment of his cathedral. He carried out his plans against the church with heart and spirit. "I robbed the church and overbore her customs," said he, many years after, when laid a dying penitent before the high altar of Durham. "I did all this not from stress of poverty, but from wanton lust of gain. My wish to do mischief was greater than my power." Into this man's hands, as King's Commissioner, had the see of Canterbury fallen, since the death of Lanfranc, and, in spite of every remonstrance, William refused to fill it. Men looked on indignantly, bishops, barons, and people, for mixed or different reasons, at this new and unheard-of injury, to see the mother church of all England lying in widowhood, the sacred throne of St. Austin, the stay of Christian religion in the realm under the feet of Ralph Flambard. Such was the state of things in England when, at the earnest request of Hugh Lalou, Earl of Chester, one of the most powerful and magnificent of the Conqueror's barons, Anselm crossed from Normandy. The Earl was a specimen, and a favorable one, of that wild and terrible aristocracy at whose mercy the Church found herself, and whom she had to reclaim or combat. He was entrusted with the defense of the western frontier against the Welsh, and he well maintained the name of the Norman sword by his fierceness and cruelty. A keen and tried soldier bred up from his youth in bodily exercises and in the midst of danger and license, lawless and undisciplined, yet generous, with arms in his hands and absolutely uncontrolled by law, opinion, or force. He was what might be expected from such a training, heedless of anything but his caprice, self-indulgence, or amusement, and reckless of the means by which he compassed them, hardy, jovial, and open-handed among his boisterous followers, quickly irritated, and utterly careless about life and suffering, yet not without a wild nobleness and freedom of character and a rude and imperfect faith. He was a lover of the world and its pomps, says his contemporary Ordericus, and accounted them the highest portion of human bliss. He loved sports and luxuries, jesters, horses, and dogs. He used daily to ride over and lay waste his own lands, caring less for priests and husbandmen than for fowlers and huntsmen. He pampered his appetite till he became so corpulent that he could scarcely walk. He cared not what he gave away, nor what he took. He was always surrounded with an enormous company of retainers, and his hall was ever in an uproar with a numerous and noisy crew of boys of high and low degree. He entertained also a great number of honorable clerks and knights, whom he delighted to have about him to share his labors as well as his riches. The chaplain of this rough baronial court, a priest named Gerald, whom Hugh had brought with him from Avranches, presented a strange contrast of high saintliness and devotion in the midst of the turbulence and licentiousness of the household where he ministered. Yet he was not without influence and weight in it, and many, we are told, listened with attention to the histories of the holy warriors in the Old Testament and the legends of the martyr soldiers of the Church, St. George and St. Sebastian, St. Maurice, the leader of the Thebasan Legion, St. Eustace and St. William, by which he endeavored to reclaim his rude hearers to seriousness and self-restraint. The Earl of Chester was, in his way, a patron and friend of religious men. He had an old-standing friendship with Anselm, and there can be little doubt that it was with the view of procuring his election to the primacy that he sent for him to England to superintend, so he said, a new monastery which he had just founded in his county. Such certainly was the talk of the day, and Anselm had such misgivings on the subject that he at first positively refused to go. And it was not till Earl Hugh, who had meanwhile been attacked with a dangerous sickness and earnestly besought his counsels in the hour of need, had pledged himself on his honor, that the reports about Anselm's intended promotion were unfounded, that he was induced to visit England. He was received with honor by the king and the court. At Canterbury, the clergy and people met him with enthusiastic welcome as their future archbishop. But he immediately left the town, and nothing more was said or done for the present to make him expect the primacy. Yet when he had accomplished the immediate objects of his visit, he found himself still detained, and the king refused his permission for him to return to Normandy. It is not easy to understand William's motives for detaining Anselm. Whatever might have been the wishes of the court, he certainly had no present intention of filling up the archbishopric, When Anselm's holiness was praised in his presence, and the speaker remarked that the abbot of B had no wishes for anything earthly, William added scoffingly, "No, not even for the archbishopric. But by the holy face of Lucca," he continued one fiercely, "other archbishop besides me there shall be none." He had occasion, however, soon after to change his mind. When he kept his court at Gloucester at Christmas 1092, his great men had petitioned that at least he would give leave that prayers should be offered up throughout England, that God would be pleased to put it into the king's heart to institute a worthy pastor to the Church of Canterbury. William, though highly offended at the petition, granted it. "Let the Church ask what she pleases," he said. "I shall not cease to work my will." Shortly after this he sickened. His danger became imminent. In a moment of remorse and terror, he was induced, among other acts of penitence and amendment, to fill up the archbishopric, and he nominated Anselm. With our modern notions about preferment, Wari can scarcely enter into the scene that followed, when the moment of trial which Anselm had for some time foreseen, without the power of escaping from it, was at length arrived, and he saw himself, after a life of quiet, on the point of being cast forth in his old age to buffet with the storms of the world, in those days a wild and rough one. Many years before this, when only prior of B and complaining of his inadequacy for his office, Maurelius, Archbishop of Rouen, had forewarned him that he must expect to be called to yet heavier burdens, and had solemnly charged him on his holy obedience not to refuse them. In compliance with this command, he had become abbot. But he was now summoned to be the restorer of the English Church, and the make head against a state of things which the English bishops, frightfully evil as many of them felt it to be, had not the heart to resist. He grew pale and trembled when he heard the acclamations which announced the king's election. When the bishops came to lead him to the king to receive investiture, he refused to go. He was too old, he said, and knew nothing of business, and further his allegiance, his canonical obedience, his counsel and services were already vowed to others. He was dragged into the king's sick chamber. William, hard man as he was moved even to tears, but his bitter entreaties to Anselm to save him from dying in the guilt of sacrilege with the archbishopric still in his hands, and the angry remonstrances of the bystanders that Anselm was troubling the king's dying hours and betraying the cause of the church, were all in vain. Anselm refused to receive the archbishopric. "Might it have been the will of God," said he afterwards of those moments, "I would gladly have died on the spot." In his distress of mind, he burst into an agony of tears, and blood gushed from his nostrils. The king became impatient. The old man was dragged to the bedside, and his right arm held out by the bishops to receive from the king the pastoral staff. But he kept his hand firmly clenched. They tried by main force to wrench it open, and when the pain they put him to caused him to cry out, the bishops held the staff against his still closed hand. He was borne forth rather than led, with hymns and acclamations, to a neighboring church, crying out, "It is naught that ye are doing, it is naught that ye are doing." It would have been difficult to discover, writes he afterwards to his along one in his senses, or the sane a madman, save that they were chanting, and I looking more like a corpse than a living man, with amazement and anguish. And on the afternoon of the same day, when I had time to recollect myself and to realize your affection, and the burden imposed on me, sorrow, so unusual with me, overcame my reason to such a degree that people thought I was dying or fainting, and brought holy water to sprinkle me or make me drink it. In spite of what had passed, he persisted in refusing to acknowledge the validity of his appointment, and the matter was meanwhile referred to the decision of those to whose obedience and service he was already bound: the Archbishop of Rouen, the Duke of Normandy, and the monastery of B. Their consent was gained, not without difficulty on the part of the monks of B. We give the letter he received from the Archbishop as a specimen of the sober and measured tone with which serious men in those days addressed a brother who was called to a high office in the Church, a tone not of congratulation for honors won, but of grave and subdued sympathy for a comrade going to his post of increased hazard and toil. Brother William, Archbishop, to his lord and friend Anselm. God's blessing and his own. I have considered long and carefully, as was due in so important a matter, the subject of the king's letter and yours, and I have asked the advice of my own friends and yours upon it. The wish on all sides is, were it possible, to keep you still among us, and yet not to do anything to oppose the divine will. But as matters stand, both cannot be fulfilled. And we therefore, as is fitting and right, submit our will to his. And in the name of God and St. Peter, and of all my friends and yours who love you for God's sake, I command you to undertake the pastoral care of the Church of Canterbury, and to receive, according to the custom of the Church, the episcopal benediction, and thenceforward to watch over the welfare of your sheep by divine providence, as we believe, committed to you. Farewell, my beloved. Anselm's nomination took place at Gloucester on the first Sunday in Lent, 1093, March 6th. But it was not till the autumn of the same year that he was at length prevailed upon by William's fair promises to undertake the primacy. He did homage, too, according to custom, and on the 4th of December he was consecrated at Canterbury by the Archbishop of York in the presence of nearly all the bishops of England. At his consecration, when, according to the Roman ritual, the book of the Gospels was opened at random and laid on his shoulders, the passage which turned up was the following. He bade many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, Come, for all things are now ready. And they all with one consent began to make excuse. Men took this as an omen of the course of his episcopate. It was no untrue augury. He stood on the verge of 12 years of anxious and unwearied service, to be repaid by unsympathizing lukewarmness or fierce persecution. The following year witnessed in England the first movements in the great struggle between the Church and the temporal power, which was to last in various forms and with various fortunes long after Igulm and his antagonists were removed from it. With the revival of strictness, intelligence, and sense of duty, which had taken place in the Norman Church since the middle of the century, it was become inevitable. Such wild folly and wickedness as that of William and his court must sooner or later have called forth rebuke and systematic opposition, and feudal barons were not men to submit tamely to rebuke and opposition from priests and monks. The contest must begin openly and in earnest, as soon as any churchman should have heart and faith to realize and fulfill his duty. Anselm had foreseen this, and that it must begin with him. He had done what he could with a good conscience to avoid the primacy, and he had been overruled. But those powers which he had not sought, which had been forced into his hand, he was not going to wield in vain or feebly. William found that, instead of an unpractical recluse, whose natural force had been abated by his monastic life, and who was incapable of energetic and decisive action, a bishop had ascended the throne of Canterbury who could deal with men, and who, when once his path was plain, knew neither despair nor fear. Anselm had not left his Norman monastery, and altered in his old age in anxiety and sorrow his whole course of life, to become a mitred cipher or tool in the impure and boisterous court of William Rufus. The agony of change once over, he had calmly mastered what he was henceforth called to, and prepared himself for the worst. From the first, says Eadmer, he perceived and foretold that many would be the troubles he should have to suffer during his pontificate. Coming therefore to a new, and to him an unwonted way of serving God, according to Solomon's precept, he stood in fear and prepared his soul for temptation, knowing that all who will live godly in Christ must needs suffer tribulation. He had given fair warning. Before he would accept the primacy, he laid before William explicitly, and in the presence of witnesses, the conditions on which alone he could consent to take it. These were that the property of the see should be restored in full and without trouble, that the obedience which as abbot of B he had vowed to Pope Urban, whom William had not yet acknowledged, should not be questioned. And thirdly, I will, said he, that in those things that pertain to God and Christian religion thou trust thyself to my counsel before all others. And as I am willing to have thee for my earthly Lord and defender, so that thou shouldest have me for thy spiritual father and soul's guardian. He had small hopes that his counsel would be taken. The untamed bull to whom ye have yoked me, said he to the bishops who were so eager for his election at Gloucester, will gore and trample upon the old and feeble sheep, his yoke-fellow. And, he continued, when he has crushed me, of yourselves there will be no one who will dare oppose him in anything. And then, rest assured, he will not scruple at his pleasure to trample upon you also. His anticipations were soon realized. When the contest began, he had to fight alone. Of the English higher clergy, 2 bishops only seemed to have shown him any sympathy. The rest either stood aloof or openly opposed him. From some of them, this was to be expected, from men like John of Bath, who had purchased his see as a good investment of capital, or the intriguing courtier William of Durham, the king's favorite, or Herbert the Wheedler, Lozinga of Norwich. Yet, acting with one these men were several of Lanfranc's bishops, men selected from the Norman monasteries for their earnestness and ability, loved and honored in their generation. But even these remained neutral, or it is not necessary to suppose them more than usually weak or selfish in order to explain their conduct. They had but ordinary clear-sightedness and courage in a time which required more. The great revolution which had been working for years on the continent was at last coming on in the farthest west, and they were not yet ready for it. With much of earthly alloy, with much also of keen and genuine sensibility to the heavenly calling of the Church, the conviction was fast spreading that the rights and powers which had been tacitly yielded to feudalism must at all hazards be reclaimed. But in times like these, when new or forgotten opinions are gradually forming themselves under old ones, when new principles are silently gathering way, there are but few who from the first descry what is approaching and master in time the true position and drift of things. Most men go on as usual, unconscious of the powers that aid awake and abroad, secretly stirring society. Custom is the stay and guide of life, and to realize change as a fact is hard. And even when it is in itself desirable, few feel sufficient confidence in themselves to warrant it to their own minds that the time is come for moving. It was a new thing for the English bishops to see a deliberate and resolute opposition to the king, a new and hard prospect to make up their minds to a life of conflict. Probably there was not one of Anselm's principles which they would have denied in the abstract, but they had not realized them as he had, and could only look at them as, under their circumstances at least, unpractical and romantic. They had been brought up under William the Conqueror's system. Under it they had seen cathedrals raised, monasteries restored, the majesty of the Church and the dignity of her prelates hon-oured by the world, and, whatever evils and abuses existed under it, a desperate conflict with the king would scarcely seem the most likely way to mend them. Moreover, Lanfranc, still the greatest name in England, the restorer of the English Church, under whom the best of her bishops had been trained, had given, as far as we can see, his countenance and hearty concurrence to the Conqueror's general policy towards the Church L. This may explain in some measure the part which the bishops took in the struggle of Anselm episcopate. So it is, however, it was not till after his death that the rulers of the English Church acknowledged him as their champion. The storm which Anselm had looked for soon broke. Symptoms of it had shown themselves even before his consecration. On the very day of his enthronement at Canterbury, The joy of the people was disturbed by the appearance of the hateful and dreaded Ralph Flambard, who came to institute Asuet against the archbishop in the king's name, and they were soon irreconcilably separated. William's extortions from the clergy, heavy and cruel as they were, had been submitted to tamely, and he treated their remonstrances as the feeble murmurs of men who were too selfish to resist his injustice in earnest. Thus the money of the church was squandered to secure his capricious favor and support his wastefulness. Grievous, too, as the burden was to the higher clergy, they were not the chief sufferers. It was on the oppressed tenantry of the church, from whom the money had to be wrung, and on her dependents and pensioners, that the tyranny fell most bitterly, on the poor who found refuge in the monasteries or were supported by their alms, on the houseless, the sick, and the stranger. Anselm, on his consecration, had with difficulty raised 500 marks on his wasted estates for a present to William, who was in want of money for one of his Norman wars. The king thought the sum too small, and as his wont was when he was offended, refused it. Anselm went to him and pressed him to accept it. Though small, it was offered freely, nor would it be the last. But he intimated plainly that he would not fall in with the king's system of extortion. As a friend, he said, you may do what you like with me and mine. On the footing of a slave, neither me nor mine shall you have. Keep your money and foul tongue to yourself. I have enough for myself. Go, get you gone, was the king's answer, in his rough and broken way. Anselm left him. He thought, says Eadmer, of the words of the gospel which had been read on the day when he first entered his cathedral. No man can serve two masters. No one now, at least he said, can accuse me of simony. The present which I meant for him shall go now, not to him but to Christ's poor, for the benefit of his soul. He tried, however, once more to regain the king's favor, but he was told that the only way was to double his present. About this he was firm, and he left the court in disgrace. William was beyond measure irritated at this resolute opposition from a clergyman, an old, feeble monk, one, too, whom he himself had in a moment of weakness placed in the position to annoy him. But nothing was done for the present to molest Anselm. He held on his course, discharging the duties of his office. In the country, living among his tenants and writing on theology. At court, preaching against luxury and effeminate fashions. And refusing absolution to the disobedient, doing whatever he could to repair the mischiefs of the last 6 frightful license which prevailed, and bishops kept aloof from him. His only hope was a synod. Could council be summoned, men might speak and act in concert, who would not act separately. The court was at Hastings, waiting for a wind to carry over the king to Normandy, and the bishops had been summoned thither to give him their blessing when he sailed. Anselm resolved to make one more effort to move William. He went to him and solemnly laid before him the state of things in England. Christian religion, he said, had well nigh perished among the people, and the land was become almost a Sodom. The only remedy was in a council of the church. William refused to hear of it. Anselm then entreated him at least to appoint abbots to the vacant and disorganized monasteries. "What are they to you?" was the fierce answer. "The abbeys, are they not mine? May I not do what I please with them, as you do with your manors? Gesaki, yours they are said, Anselm, to protect, but not to lay waste, for they belong to God, to maintain his servants, not to support your wars. Your predecessor dared not have held such language to my father," was the reply. "Go, I will do nothing for you." Anselm retired and consulted the bishops. They could suggest no other advice than that of purchasing the king's favor. The archbishop indignantly rejected it. For the honor of the church, in justice to his poor tenants, on mere grounds of policy, he could not listen to so unworthy an expedient. "My vassals," said he, "have been plundered and made a prey since Lanfranc's death, and I have nothing to give them. Shall I further go on to flay them alive?" The bishops recommended him to give at least the 500 marks which he had originally offered. "No," said he has refused it once. It is gone to the poor now." William was furious when this was reported to him. "Go tell him," was his message, "that I hated him yesterday. Henceforth I will hate him daily more and more. Father and archbishop he shall be to me no longer. Let him not wait here to give me his blessing. I will cross without it." Such was the opening of the great trial of strength between the church and feudalism in England. When opposite principles which have been for some time silently growing up together in society at length come into collision, they do not usually meet at first, except in a confused and partial manner. The war begins with skirmishes about petty posts, with disputes about trifles and quarrels seemingly personal. Conflicting tendencies touch each other and struggle in their distant results. In time, things clear, issues show themselves more distinctly, and are reduced into definite and tangible questions. Reasons, given and answered, bring up new views of things, disengage and disentangle what was misunderstood or dimly seen in men's own position and that of then opponents. And so the main battle is pushed farther and farther back on those great points upon which the whole movement rests and centers. This apparently petty dispute about 500 marks, involving, as it did, very sacred principles of that Christian law which was committed to the Church's keeping, and for the observance of which the Church, whenever she has understood her true position, has always made herself responsible, led on, by a series of close and obvious consequences, to the opening of those great questions between the spiritual and temporal powers, questions among the highest that can engage men's thoughts, which even in our own day remain unsettled. There was enough in what had passed to open the eyes of all parties to the state of things with which they had to deal, to make it clear to Anselm that, if the law and powers of the Church were to continue among the most solemn realities of society, her independence must be at once and unequivocally asserted in the face of all England, and to William that the Archbishop was resolved at all hazards to make that sort. There are more than 700 years, with their burden of events, of sins and their punishments, between us and St. Anselm, and this vast interval of time, with the fears and jealousies which are its legacy, make it necessary to say a word, not in defense or excuse of his line of conduct, for that it needs not, but in explanation of it. For, in maintaining the claims of the spiritual power, he maintained them, as involved and expressed in the claims of the Pope, and this at once prejudices his cause in modem eyes. In the present unhealthy and shattered state of Christendom, we people past history with phantasms, and color it with hues, which belong to our own days. Here in England, to have at any time supported the cause of the popes shuts a man out from sympathy and even justice. But, without going into the doctrinal part of the question, it is plain that we cannot speak of the Western Church of the 11th century as if its circumstances and history were the same as those of the same church in the 19th. The union of European Christendom under the Pope was the arrangement which had lasted under God's providence ever since the barbarians had been Christianized. It was the dispensation which was natural and familiar to men, the only one they could imagine, a dispensation, moreover, under which religion had achieved its conquests. The notion of being independent of the See of St. Peter was one which was never found among the thoughts of a religious man even as a possibility, which never occurred even to an irreligious one except as involving disobedience and rebellion. We would have people reflect who shrink from looking with favor on any person or any policy which strengthened the See of Rome, that there was a time when the authority of the popes was no controverted dogma, when it was as much a matter of course, even to those who opposed its exercise, as much an understood and received point as the primacy of Canterbury and the king's supremacy is with us. And that in such times men fought for the church as they must do always, under the forms, it may be temporary or faulty ones, in which her cause came into their hands. We cannot conceive how the keenest and most jealous Protestant can refuse to admit as much as this when he calmly realizes that what is history to him was the unknown future or the confused and hurried present to other men. And moreover, supposing the state of things we are speaking of to have been as corrupt and disordered as he deems it, we have but little right to judge those who worked with faith and a high heart under a faulty traditinal system which involved and upheld unity in the church, when we acquiesce so easily in our state of division and isolation from the great body of believers. Nor was it only custom and association which bound men in those days to the order of things under which they had been bound. Whatever evil there may have been in it, there was also good, on a great and noble scale, to which they were keenly alive. The unearthly origin of the Church, its unity and essential independence, the superiority of its claims to those of any power of this world, the idea of the Church as the kingdom of heaven, a universal spiritual empire, all this found an adequate memorial and expression in the papacy. In those times, men could not conceive of a law which had not a person to administer it. They could not realize an authority or power which had not its representative. And they saw in the Pope not merely the type, but also the real and highest earthly organ of a power not of this world, not the symbol only, but the divinely ordained guardian and minister of the great law of unity. Add to this, what is not matter of theory or doctrine, but a fact of history, that in the time of which we speak, the cause of the popes was that of religion and holiness. With whatever amount of mistake, misdoing, or corruption among its supporters, however feebly they may often have realized their own principles, it was based on faith in the unseen. It resisted and rebuked the world. It set a true value on the things of time. It is no wonder, then, it would be a strange thing had it been otherwise, that such men as St. Anselm should have been found in its ranks. Certainly nothing so hampered the free working of the lawless and arbitrary spirit of feudalism as the existence of this system in the Church. Nations and their rulers could not feel that moral irresponsibility which they have since gained. They were members of Christendom as well as distinct political bodies, united as Christians to others, and accountable as Christians to the whole Church. There was a standard recognized by all higher than that of political expediency, a commonly acknowledged laudable to reach and visit crimes which national laws were ready to screen or were too weak to punish. There was an appeal from all earthly tribunals to one not merely higher, but different in kind. An appeal to the See of Rome was not only virtually an appeal to the whole of Christendom, it was also an appeal to the judgment seat of our Lord. It was to break loose from the restraints imposed by the still real unity of the Church that the feudal princes opposed so vigorously the power of the popes. It was not that they resisted or doubted their claim to be the divinely appointed presidents of the Church, that they acknowledged as much as they did the local claims of their own bishops. It was the authority of religion and the Church, which they felt to be represented by the popes, which excited their impatience and hatred. They acknowledged the law while they disobeyed it. They thought to escape the invisible powers of the Church by fettering her ministers or refusing to hear her sentence. But they never doubted either the reality of those powers or her right, in the abstract, to use them. Their opposition was based not on any religious scruples, scarcely on any distinct views of political greatness, but on the privileges of the feudal military law, on precedents exempting them from the law of the Church. They recognized its jurisdiction. What they fought for was unlimited dispensation from it in their own persons. The results of his quarrel with Anselm had taught William that the Church, humbled as she was, might yet under able and resolute guidance, such as she had gained in the Archbishop, be able to check and thwart him. And her power of maintaining her ground against him was visibly strengthened by her union with the rest of the Western Church and with the Pope. Whatever measures William might pursue in England, he could not prevent Anselm from ultimately falling back on an authority to which it was impossible, without avowed disobedience, to refuse to listen. It became William's object, therefore, to perplex and weaken the archbishop by detaching him, indirectly if possible, from the Pope and isolating him from the rest of Christendom. The circumstances of the times were favorable to his attempt. There were at the moment two claimants of the throne of St. Peter, Urban II and the antipope Gebert, and the English Church had hitherto acknowledged neither. Without therefore denying the rights of the Apostolic See, William, acting on the precedent established by his father, might require the bishops to suspend their obedience till he had decided which of the two rivals had really a claim to it. But there was a difficulty in the case of the archbishop. He had already acknowledged Urban and had distinctly reserved his obedience to him before he would accept the primacy. William, however, was not to be turned aside from his purpose easily. The point soon came to an issue between him and the archbishop. In what manner and with what results will be seen from the following transaction, the details of which are given by Edmer. On Mid-Lent Sunday, 1095, March 11th, the prelates and nobility of England, with a large concourse of the lower orders, met at the hour of prime in the church of Rockingham Castle to hold a solemn council. The peers had been summoned to answer an appeal made to them by the archbishop for their judgment and counsel in a very important question lately raised between himself and the king. When he had applied to the king for leave to make the customary journey to Rome in order to receive the Metropolitan Pall, the king had asked him from which pope he meant to ask it, and on being told from Urban, he had charged the archbishop with a breach of his fealty and allegiance in daring to recognize a pope not yet acknowledged by the realm, and told him that he must either disclaim Urban till the king's pleasure were known or leave England. His obedience to Pope Urban, the king said, was incompatible with his duty as a subject. It was on this point that the archbishop had asked and received permission to seek the advice of his peers. He laid his case fully before them, reminding them that they had forced him into his present position, with full warning from him of the difficulties which were likely to ensue, and with a pledge on their part of sympathy and aid. "It is a grievous thing for me," he concluded, "to despise and disown the vicar of St. Peter. It is a grievous thing to break the faith which I promised to keep to the king according to God's law. Nevertheless, it is a grievous thing to be told that I cannot do my duty to either one of these except at the expense of my allegiance to the other." The bishops, to whom he had especially addressed himself, declined to give him any counsel for the present, except on condition of his submitting unconditionally to the king. But they offered to report what he had said to William, who was waiting the issue in another part of the castle, and communicate what he might say in answer. And thus the question was put off till the next day. The following morning the assembly met again. The archbishop took his seat in the midst and repeated his request to the bishops for their counsel. But he again asked in vain. They replied as they had done the day before. They would give no counsel in religious grounds, secundum diem, which should in any respect oppose the king's will. They gave their answer like men who felt the shame and cowardice of their position. They hung down their heads in silence, says Edmer, expecting what was coming on them. Anselm's countenance lighted up when he heard their determination, and raising his eyes to heaven, he solemnly addressed his protest to the assembled bishops and nobles. "Since you," he said, "who are called the pastors of Christ's flock, and you who are styled chiefs among the people, refuse your counsel to me your chief, except according to the will of one man, I will betake myself to the chief shepherd and prince of all. I will fly to the angel of great counsel, and from him I will receive the counsel which I will follow in this my cause, yea, rather, his cause and that of his church." He says to the most blessed of the apostles, Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." And again to all the apostles jointly, "He who hears you hears me, and he who despises you despises me. It was primarily to St. Peter, and in him to the other apostles. It is to the vicar of St. Peter, and through him to the other bishops who fill the apostles' places, that these words, as we believe, were addressed. But to no emperor whatsoever, to no king or duke or earl. In what point we must be subject to earthly princes, the same angel of great counsel has taught us, saying, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. These are the words and counsels of God, and by them I will abide. Know ye therefore all of you, that in the things that are God's I will render obedience to the vicar of St. Peter. In those that belong of right to the earthly dignity of my lord the king, I will render him both faithful counsel and service, to the best of my knowledge and power. The bishops had a difficult part to play. They had to support the king's cause in the face of their own convictions, in the face of what they believed to be the plain meaning of texts of Scripture, in the face of their vow of canonical obedience, with the full consciousness that the eyes of all, allies and opponents, were open to their false position, that they would find sympathy neither in England nor in Christendom, and that by none were they so thoroughly seen through and despised as by the king, whose tools they had consented to make themselves. The archbishop's speech was received in clamor and tumult. No one ventured to answer it. No one would report it to the king, and the assembly broke up in confusion. Anselm was not daunted. He went himself to the royal chamber and repeated his words in William's presence. The day was spent by the king's party in angry and fruitless deliberation. William looked to the bishops to defeat Anselm on his own ground. The bishops, irritated at once by the hopelessness of their case and by their fear of disappointing William, were unable to agree among themselves upon the course to be pursued. The archbishop, meanwhile, had returned to the church to wait the result. While his opponents, broken up into knots of 2 and 3, were engaged in eager and fruitless discussion, he remained in his seat, and at last, wearied out with the delay, leaning his head against the wall, he fell into a calm sleep. Towards the end of the day, the bishops, with some of the nobility, came to him from the king. Their advice to him, they said, was that he should submit without further hesitation to the customs of the realm, which the king valued as highly as his crown, and at once give up Urban. Anselm asked till the next day to return a formal answer. They thought he was wavering or at a loss for an immediate reply, and urged the king to take advantage of his indecision. William, Bishop of Durham, who had throughout taken the lead against the archbishop, and who had engaged to force him either to commit himself to a disavowal of Urban or to resign his ring and crozier, now came to him, and called on him peremptorily to yield to the king his dignity and prerogative, or to prepare at once for his own just sentence. But he had overstepped his mark. Anselm answered quietly and briefly, Whosoever wishes to prove that, because I will not renounce the obedience of the chief bishop of the venerable Holy Roman Church, I am therefore breaking faith and allegiance to my earthly king, let him come forward, and he shall find me ready, as I ought, and where I ought, to render my answer. They had nothing to reply, and retired to the king. A suppressed murmur of indignation ran through the crowd of the lower orders, which had filled the body of the church the whole day, and had hitherto looked on in silent sympathy, not daring to express their feelings. At length a soldier stepped out of the throng and knelt before the archbishop. "Lord and Father," said he, "thy children humbly beseech thee by me, that thy heart be not troubled by what thou hast heard, but remember blessed Job, who vanquished the devil on a dunghill, and avenged Adam, whom the devil had conquered in paradise." William of Durham had to report to the king. Tamely and faintly, the complete failure of his one attempt. Evening was closing in, and the assembly again adjourned. The king was exasperated in the too highest degree with the archbishop, and scarcely less so with the bishops. At last, William of Durham proposed that Anselm should be deprived by violence and driven out of England. But against this, the lay barons, who had been moved by the archbishop's calm self-possession and readiness in answering, protested strongly. "If this then pleases you not," said the king, "Williat will please you? In this realm I will endure no equal. It is by following your counsel and plans that things have been brought to this pass. Away with you, get you gone, and lay your heads together, for by God's countenance, if ye condemn him not, according to my will, I will condemn you." William found it impossible to prevail upon the bishops to pass sentence on Anselm, but he found them willing to renounce his obedience. The lay barons, on the other hand, firmly refused to follow their example. As a feudal superior, he did not claim their obedience. As their archbishop and spiritual father, he had done nothing to forfeit it. This refusal left the bishops alone in their miserable position, and their confusion was increased by William's calling on them severally to declare whether they renounced their obedience to the archbishop unconditionally or only so far as it implied the claims of Pope Urban. They were divided in their answers. Those who refused an unconditional renunciation were driven from William's presence and had to regain his favor by large gifts. But it was an impolitic step on his part, for it broke up his party among the bishops, and by forcing them to this disgraceful alternative, he brought to a head the growing feeling of disgust and scorn with which their conduct was viewed even by the nobility. Those especially among them who had entirely renounced the archbishop were openly insulted even in the court. It was plain that their influence would no longer weigh with anyone or their concurrence give plausibility to any measure. There remained nothing farther to be done against the archbishop except in the way of open violence, and men were not yet ripe for that. It was agreed, therefore, that matters should be left as they were for the present, and should stand over till after the following Whitsuntide. William immediately dispatched two of his chapelains, Gerard, afterwards Archbishop of York, and William Warrelwast, to intrigue at Rome. What they said or did there does not appear. They were men who, as they showed afterwards, would not be scrupulous in serving their master. But the result of their negotiation was the mission by Pope Urban of Cardinal Walter of Albano to the king, secretly bearing with him the Metropolitan Paul. On landing in England, the legate took no notice of the archbishop, though he had to pass through Canterbury, but went straight to the court. Of his proceedings there, which were looked upon at the time with great distrust and dissatisfaction by the archbishop's friends, all we know is that William was induced, by the grant, Eadmer says, of special privileges from the Roman see, to acknowledge Urban, but that when he demanded in return the deposition of Anselm, by the authority, or at least with the consent of the legate, he was at once and peremptorily refused. Disappointed and baffled, he seems to have resolved to put the best face upon matters and consent to a reconciliation with the archbishop, which took place shortly after, but not without another vain attempt on the part of the bishops to induce Anselm, by concealing from him the real state of things at court, to purchase the king's favor by a large present. William's party wished the archbishop to receive the pall from the hands of the king. Anselm objected, for the privileges and powers which it symbolized and conveyed belonged not to the king to give, but to the spiritual ruler of the church. It was determined, therefore, that it should be laid on the high altar of Canterbury, from whence the archbishop should take it. On the third Sunday after Trinity, the legate, bearing it in a silver casket, was met at Canterbury by the Archbishop and Bishops of England in procession, barefooted but in their sacerdotal vestments, and conducted to the cathedral, where Anselm, wearing for the first time the symbol of his metropolitan dignity, celebrated the Holy Eucharist. The gospel read in the service was the same passage which had been taken as the presage of his episcopate at his consecration, the parable of the Great Supper L. Those monitory words were still to be fulfilled. The work in which he was engaged, though so far he had been successful, was not yet over. The reconciliation did not last long. William continued as profligate and oppressive as ever, and soon began to molest the archbishop personally. For some alleged neglect of feudal service, he was summoned to appear before the king's court. "We looked for peace," said he on receiving the order, "and there is no good, for the time of healing, and behold trouble." It was become plain that the king was resolved to crush him. In England, he was fighting single-handed. There was nothing left for him but to refer matters to the Pope. We will give his own account of his position about this time in an extract from a letter written by him to Pope Urban shortly after he had received the pall. "Holy Father," he writes after having explained why he had not been able to visit Rome, "it grieves me that I am what I am, that I am not what I was. It grieves me that I am a bishop, for my sins prevent me from doing the work of a bishop. When I was in a humble station, I seemed to be doing something. Now that I am exalted to high place, I am weighed down with a load which is too heavy for me, and I do no good either for myself or others. I long to escape from an intolerable charge and to lay down my burden. On the other hand, I fear to offend God. The fear of God, which made me undertake it, compels me to keep it. If I knew God's will, I would direct my will and conduct according to it. But it is hidden from me, and I know not what to do. I cannot see my way or make out what conclusion I ought to come to." He goes on to entreat Urban's prayers, lest, tossed by the waves of such thoughts, he should altogether bink or attain to nothing, and prays that, if at last, in shipwreck, he should have to seek refuge from the storm in the bosom of his mother the Church, he may, for the sake of him who shed his blood for us, find there ready and compassionate aid and solace. Such were his feelings and prospects in 1096. Shortly after, in that same year, he was forced by William to quit England as a banished man. The causes of his exile are thus stated in a letter written by him 2 years after to Pascal II, Urban's, "I had before my eyes in England a multitude of evils which it was my province to correct. I could neither correct them nor yet tolerate them without sin. The king required me, on the score of duty, to consent to his will and pleasure in matters which were against the law and will of God. For, without his command, he would not that any successor of the apostles should be received or be so styled in England, nor that I should hold communication with him or obey his decrees. Since he came to the throne, which is now 13 years, he has not allowed a council to be held. The lands of the church he gave to his vassals. And if in these and such like matters I sought counsel, everyone refused it to me, even my own suffragans, except according to his will. Seeing then these and many other violations of the will and law of God, I asked leave of him to visit the Apostolic See, that I might receive advice from thence touching my own soul, and the office enjoined me. The king answered that I had committed a crime against him in merely thus asking leave, and gave me the choice either of making amends for this as for an offense, and giving him security that I would never ask this leave again, or appeal to the Apostolic See, or else of taking my speedy departure from his realm. I chose rather to depart than to agree to such a scandalous act. I came to Rome, as you know, and laid the whole matter before my lord the Pope. The king, as soon as I had left England, laid hands on the whole archbishopric, and leaving just enough to clothe and feed our monks, turned it to his own purposes. Warned and entreated by my lord the Pope to alter his conduct, he has scorned to do so, and to this day holds on in the same course. It is now the 3rd year since I thus left England. The little that I brought with me, and the large sums which I have borrowed and not yet repaid are all spent. And thus deeply in debt hut possessed of nothing, I am living on the bounty of our venerable father, the Archbishop of Lyons. As the letter states, the king, though he had acknowledged Urban, had treated Anselm's application as a breach of his oath of allegiance. The nobility took part against the archbishop, and his suffragans again deserted him. Their address to him is too remarkable to be omitted. Lord Father, we well know that thou art a pious and holy man and hast thy desires in heaven. We, by our relatives whom we support, by temporal circumstances in which we are engaged, are withheld from ascending to your magnanimity and from making sport of the world. But if you are willing to descend to us and imitate our conduct, we will assist you with the same counsel with which we assist each other, and will succor you in your embarrassments. But, should you abide by your former principles, we will not desert our fidelity to the king, nor separate ourselves from him. Anselm replied, "You have answered well. Go to your lord. I will hold to my God." Molar, from Eadmer, P82L. On his refusing to comply with the king's wishes, he was ordered to be ready to quit England in 10 days. Before he left the court, he went to the king with a cheerful and pleasant countenance. Anna offered him his benediction. "I know not when I shall see you again," he said, "and if you refuse it not, I would fain give you my blessing, the blessing of a father to his son, of the Archbishop of Canterbury to the King of England." The rough king was for a moment touched, perhaps awed, by Anselm's calm but solemn way of closing their personal intercourse. He could not refrain from bowing his head, while the Archbishop made the sign of the cross over him and departed, and they never met again. Anselm was persecuted to the last with insult and annoyance. As he may be embarking at Dover, William Warrelwast, the king's chaplain, who had been living, we have altered a few words in this translation, for several days at the Archbishop's board, caused his luggage be broken open on the beach, and searched in the hope of finding treasure. Thus he went forth to his exile. It was the issue he had foreseen from the first, to pass his old age in destitution, and without certain dwelling place, in journeyings often, in perils of robbers, in weariness and painfulness, in hunger and thirst, in cold and nakedness. The part of a confessor was no easy or safe one. Yet in those days, in spite of the wickedness and misery so rife in them, the promise made to those who leave all for the gospel of finding, even here, houses and brethren an hundredfold, was still amply fulfilled. Travelers, especially if they bore a religious character, were generally sure of a welcome, not as foreigners, but as Christians. Toilsome and dangerous as their road usually was, they might reckon on a monastery at the end of each day's journey where they would find not only rest but sympathy. And moreover, in spite of imperfect civilization and fierce wars, Christendom was in a very great measure, even politically, one body, and national distinctions were often forgotten in the common citizenship of the Church. Thus it was no strange thing for a native of the South to connect his name and fortunes forever with a people of the North. We have in Lanfranc, for instance, an Italian, first the ruler and all but the founder of the most famous Norman monastery, and then, as primate of England, master of the sympathies, and guiding the ecclesiastical action of these same Normans among their newly conquered Saxon subjects. And shortly after we see another Italian, trained in the same Norman abbey, returning in his old age to his native land, a stranger and an exiled Archbishop of Canterbury. Along his road, and in Italy, Anselm was received, as was due to his name and cause, with honor by the great, with almost enthusiastic love by the poor. Nothing is more striking in Eadmer's minute but unstudied narratives than his account of the intercourse between the Archbishop and the lower orders, and the interest he excited among them. Over and above his untiring sympathy for their wants and wishes, bodily and spiritual, there was a charm in his singular elasticity of character and graceful bearing, in his easy gaiety and hearty condescending kindness, which drew them in throngs around him. His countenance alone, says his companion, even one seen too where he was not known, arrested their admiring attention. While staying in the camp of the Duke of Apulia, the very Saracens of the army, some of whom had shared his bounty, used to bless him with uplifted hands and salute him after their national fashion, kissing their own hands and bending their knees before him as he passed through their quarters. 3. But his quarrel was taken up feebly at Rome. He waited through 2 years of negotiation, but nothing was done. His able and seasonable defense of the Latin Creed against the Greeks at the Council of Bari, together with his uncomplaining cheerfulness, had won him the sympathy of the Italian bishops, and by many of them, the indecision and lukewarmness of the Roman court were felt strongly. At the Council of Lateran, 1099, this feeling showed itself. We quote Dr. Moller's account of the proceedings with a few verbal alterations. At Easter, the customary Roman synod was held. Many Gallic and Italian bishops were present, At the conclusion, the canons which had been passed were again to be read. As the synod was held publicly in the church, in the same manner as the assembly of the lords and bishops, which Anselm had convened, at the commencement of his contest, many of the people flocked to the important discussion. It was desirable that the resolutions should be distinctly read. The Bishop of Lucca, who had a powerful voice, was therefore selected for this office. He had read but a few decrees when he suddenly paused and, under violent internal excitement, manifested by his agitated appearance and by the various expressions of his countenance, addressed the Pope in these violent words: "What are we doing? We are loading our people with decrees, and we offer no resistance to the despotism of tyrants. Their oppressions and robberies of the Church are daily reported to this see. As the head of all, you are called upon for counsel and assistance, but with what success is known and deplored by the whole world. From the ends of the earth there sits one among us in meek and humble silence. But his silence is a loud cry. The greater his humility, the milder his mood. The more powerful is he with God, and the more should he inflame us. It is now 2 years since his arrival, and what assistance has he received? Know ye not all to whom I allude? It is to Anselm, the primate of England." With these words he raised his staff and struck it so violently upon the pavement that the church re-echoed around. The Pope looked towards him and said, "It is sufficient, Ranger. It is sufficient. Good counsel shall soon be adopted." Moeller, pp. 86-87. The council, however, broke up without any further steps being taken, and Anselm at length left Italy in despair and took refuge, as he states in the letter quoted above, with the Archbishop of Lyons Alzey. The death of the Pope, which happened shortly afterwards, relieved William from the difficulty into which he had brought himself by acknowledging Urban. "Evil be with him who cares for it," was his remark on hearing the news. He was resolved not to repeat the mistake, especially as the new pope was reported to be one of Anselm's sort. "His popedom," he said with an oath, "shall not override me this time. Now that I am free, I will remain beau." It must be said in fairness that Dr. Moeller, not from any one blind partiality, approves Urban's moderation. The Pope, he says, could not act otherwise. Anselm, however, certainly did feel that Urban might have done something for him, but showed no disposition to do it. See Epistolary 40. Dr. Moeller is mistaken in saying that the Bishop of Lucca called for William's unconditional deposition. There were many measures of punishment short of that, but the career of this miserable man was coming to a close. Men shuddered at his frightful blasphemies and his ferocious hatred against everything connected with religion. They waited with awe to see where his reckless course would end, and looked out for visible signs of the presence and power of the evil one to whom he had sold himself. He had sworn with an oath, on recovering from his last sickness, that God should never have any good in him for all the evil which he had brought upon him. From that time, says Eadmer, he succeeded in everything he wished for or attempted. The very wind and sea seemed to serve his will, as if God would leave him without excuse by granting all that he wished for. Yet, said those around him, never a night came but he lay down a worse man than he rose, and never a morning but he rose worse than he lay down. He heard of Urban's death in October 1099. On the 2nd of August following, he rode out at midday, after a wild debauch, to hunt in the New Forest. The chase, which his father had made by laying waste hearth and burial ground, and in which 2 of his family had already perished. In the evening, his body was found pierced by an arrow through the heart. This is all that is certainly known of his end. The account commonly received was that he was killed by a chance arrow from Sir Walter Tyrrell. Wild one, too, and strange tales were circulated respecting the circumstances of his death, the warnings which he had received, the weapon with which he was slain, the invocation of the name of the evil one with which he called for the fatal discharge. showing at least the deep and peculiar awe with which his contemporaries regarded his mysterious end, and which even at this distance of time we can hardly help sharing while we read their accounts. In the full tide of his triumph, on the eve of adding Poitou and Aquitaine to his dominions, of all princes of the West, the most wicked yet the most prosperous, he was struck down in a moment, impenitent and unshriven, with the spoils of sacrilege, which he had relinquished in sickness, once more in his hands. His body was found by some charcoal burners, who threw it into their cart, as if it had been the carcass of some savage beast of chase, and carried it into Winchester, his blood dropping along the road as they went. He was buried the next day in the cathedral choir, for he had been a king of England, but his funeral was a hurried and unwept one. The church bells in many places, which toll, says Ordericus, for the poorest beggars and basest women, told not for him. And he continues, out of the vast heaps of treasure which he had wrung from rich and poor, no alms were given for his soul.